This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
You lost all constitutional rights the moment you walked through that door. When the judge sat down there, I sentenced you to 10 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. You walked in that door, you was a number. And the inmate understood that.
If you're out there and live past the period to be in here, just lay down and do it.
Those inmates that were here in the institution during an execution, it had an impression on them that maybe was still with them to some extent. Maybe they don't think about it anymore, but it had an impression on them, I'm sure.
They wouldn't let me out until I get back to stuff. 7 months later, I give it back to them.
That was one of the problems we ran into. You had 5 or 6 guys that were sitting in a place smoking and joking and drinking coffee. Pretty quick, they'd hatched a plan in there to get under your skin some way or try to figure a way out.
Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Behind Gray Walls podcast, a podcast about the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women who lived and worked here. My name's Anthony, and I'm in the studio here with Sam.
Hi, everybody.
And across the country, we have Skye.
I'm here across the country. Can you believe? I'm still in disbelief.
It's almost like you're here. We're lucky to be looking at you actually on Zoom today. We've never really done this recorded where we actually see each other. It's just disembodied voices.
Yeah, unfortunately, because you two are sitting across the table from each other, I actually am looking at a microphone, so I do really appreciate that you guys have given me the actual POV experience of having the microphone in front of me. But yes, I'm currently looking at the mug shots of our first 10 guys that Anthony covered with our blanket, which we were using as a sound dampener.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so great to be back in the trenches, guys.
Yeah. Don't forget the potato sack that we
of
still
course,
have hanging up.
I would never. I would never.
It's like you're in the room, and it looks like we're in your closet. So yeah,
it's true. That's great. So it really, we are just this. We should have been doing this the whole time. I think
we
we're
really
learning.
should be.
It only took us 11 seasons or whatever to figure out this concept called Zoom. It's been around since our second year.
Yeah.
But we haven't done more advances since you're here. We added another blanket.
There's a whole other blanket behind the
Oh my
camera,
gosh.
though. It's over here from
Big
the
changes.
I'm not going to recognize this place next time I'm actually there.
Yeah, it almost feels like a recording studio, like almost, and not just a World War I, trench.
I actually really love it. It is of course a recording studio that is unique to that place, which is so unique on its own.
If you're having a good day, if you want to continue the good vibes of whatever you're experiencing, just skip 30 minutes ahead to the rest of the Skye story.
Oh, there will be parts in mine where you have to fast forward to. So
Yeah,
Maybe
you're at the wrong episode.
yeah.
Listener discretion is advised.
Deeply advised in this episode. Yeah. Oh boy.
The District Court of the 2nd Judicial District of the State of Idaho, in and for the County of Idaho, is now in session, and the grand jury of said County of Idaho, State of Idaho, is now in session.
A hush fell onto the courtroom as the audience, filled with anger, excitement, and morbid curiosity, waited eagerly to watch the trial unfold.
That the said Andrew Gilbert is accused by the said county attorney, W.N. Scales, by this, his information, of the crime of murder of the first degree, committed as follows to wit. That the said Andrew Gilbert, on or about the 4th day of December 1900, and prior to said preliminary examination, and prior to the filling of this information, at the County of Idaho and State of Idaho, did then and there feloniously, unlawfully, willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with malice aforethought, kill and murder one Joseph Smith, a human being, by then and there feloniously, unlawfully, willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with malice aforethought, striking, wounding, and cutting the body and person of the said Joseph Smith with a knife then and there held in the hand of said Andrew Gilbert.
After the charges were read, Andrew stood. At medium height, he had a muscular build. At 46 years old, he wore his light brown hair short, with a strong mustache.
Andrew Gilbert, what is your further plea?
Not guilty.
The judge walked the jury through the stipulations and the statute of the law in court. W.N. Scales acted as the county prosecuting attorney, and Good and Clay McNames stood as the defense. Petite little Nancy Smith, her brown curls, soft features, simple dress and all, stood and walked forward. The first person to take the stand. A powerful move by the prosecution.
My name is Nancy Smith. I am 18 years old. I live at Joseph Earp's, my father. Joseph Smith, now deceased, was my husband. I am acquainted with the defendant, Andrew Gilbert. I have known him for 8 years. On or about the 4th day of December, 1900, I was at the Clearwater on Camp Dewey, County of Idaho, State of Idaho. I had lived there from last of September until the 4th of December. Joseph Smith was living with me at that time, and Granville Smith, my baby, which was 7 months old. I was present at the difficulty between the defendant, Andrew Gilbert, and Joseph Smith on or about the 4th day of December, 1900, at Camp Dewey on the Clearwater.
At Camp Dewey, Nancy and Joseph lived in a tent, constructed from wagon sheets. The small tent did not have a lot of room for a 3-person family, especially when accounting for the 2 stoves and stovepipes needed to fight against the biting December air. Another sheet divided the tent into 2 rooms, with one stove used for heating and the other area designated as the kitchen for cooking. They had a bed, 3 chairs, and a baby stroller, which doubled as a cradle for the infant son Gran to sleep in. Joe sat in one of 3 chairs in the room, settling down for the evening with a book.
I was coaxing Mr. Smith to go to bed. I was undressed, prepared to go to bed. The baby was in the baby buggy asleep.
But Joe suddenly became alarmed and muttered,
It's Gilbert.
Gilbert came crashing in, knocking over the stove and leaping on to Joseph, who he struck, threw to the side of the tent and struck again. As the men fought, they knocked over the crib, throwing the screaming baby to the ground.
I threw the baby on the bed, and Mr. Smith, he called to me.
My God, Nancy, pull him off me. He's killing me.
Gilbert pinned Joe down and stabbed him repeatedly. Nancy grabbed him by his coat collar and jerked him backwards. Gilbert grabbed Joseph's gun. Nancy tried to grab the weapon and he slammed her into the tent's central post and attempted to twist Nancy's hand off the weapon. Joe managed by now to get Nancy's revolver from the trunk with his shaking, bloody hands. Gilbert fled.
He has killed me.
Pete Olson entered the tent and Joseph raised the gun at him. Pete yelled, throwing up his hands.
I'm not Gilbert.
Joe stumbled out in the night and took aim. The first shot struck Gilbert across the side of his throat and face. Gilbert grabbed the barrel of the gun, sending the second shot in the air just over his head. The men stumbled and fell into the riverbank, splashing into the icy water. The men fought viciously over the gun in between mouthfuls of water and desperate gasps for air.
I got the baby and followed them, and as I run outside, Mr. Gilbert fell and Mr. Smith fell on him.
Nancy, help!
Pete, help!
Let the sons of bitches fight it out.
Finally, Walter Rice and Breckenridge intervened and took the gun. Gilbert, bleeding quite badly from his throat, fled. Walter Rice helped Nancy carry Joe into the tent, where they placed him on the bed.
After we brought Smith into the tent after he was cut, I and Walter Rice took his clothes from him. I found some wounds on Mr. Smith. I don't know, one was here and one was right back in here, and the other was right about here.
Nancy pointed at several spots on her chest.
I seen Mr. Smith's entrails. I think I could have covered them all with both hands that way at the time.
I can't be with you much longer.
Joe's words became quite insensible, but he managed to ask, for one final request, that Nancy bring him his 7-month-old baby, Gran.
I hope God Almighty will take care of you and my little baby.
He was too hurt to hold his boy. He ran his hand along the child's neck and then kissed his son on the head one final time.
Joseph Smith is dead. He died on the 5th of December at 1 o'clock in the morning.
After an extensive cross-examination, which Nancy answered every detail of the tent, the crime, and the intoxication of both men, she left the witness stand, and her father took her place.
My name is Joseph Earp. I live in Idaho County. My occupation is farming and working, some by the day's work. I live on a ranch. Joseph Smith lived down at Dewey Camp on the Clearwater. He is a son-in-law of mine. On December 4th, 1900, I was at home early in the morning, and I went from there down to Camp Dewey.
Earp, in the mood for some whiskey after another hard day of work, found himself in the crowded Skaggs saloon. Inside, he found Andrew Gilbert and Joe Smith arguing. Andrew told Joe,
"Why in hell didn't you come over to my place and get that pony you stole from me last spring?"
I didn't steal any pony from you last spring. Andy, you want to kill me? I have got that thumb knocked out of place, but I can whip you right on less ground than you are standing on.
You?
Yes, you.
Boys, you should not have any trouble in here.
Finally, the father-in-law stepped in.
I say, boys, don't have no trouble here. Listen to me. Talk a little while.
Earp then let Gilbert explain his frustration over the pony that had went missing last spring. Earp tried to talk Gilbert down and explain the whole thing had just been one big misunderstanding. Joe went home, and Gilbert continued to drink. After several more beers, Gilbert told Earp,
"Earp, you're a pretty damn good man, but that is a son of a bitch of a son-in-law you have."
And before Earp knew it, Gilbert returned to his ranting about the stolen horse.
"I intend to kill that son of a bitch son-in-law of yours."
Andy, that is a hard word to say. Listen to me a while. And for that little woman's sake, don't never go around his place to have trouble. If you're going to have any trouble with him, catch him away from there.
My name's Walter Rice. I'm 22. I live at Dewey most of the time. I am acquainted with Andrew Gilbert, the defendant. I've known him, I'm not positive. 6 or 7 years, though, I think.
Rice then went on to tell his version of events, hearing the screaming, then running to the scene of the crime.
Mrs. Smith was standing at the edge of the river with the baby in her arms and crying.
Beckenridge, with the help of Rice, got in the water and wrestled the rifle away from the two fighting men. Rice then helped Nancy get Smith back into the tent and stripped off his wet clothing.
He was cut. I seen that he was cut on the side of the breast, side and the breast both, and seen that his entrails were out. And what I judged to be a piece of the lung, I seen some of the entrails, and the end of the lung was out of the wound. Well, sir, I would judge that there was a bunch of entrails about that big.
Pete Olson took the stand, then Deputy Sheriff J.H. Byram and Deputy Sheriff S.M. Williams. Throughout the trial, previous witnesses are called back to the stand. There are redirects and cross-examinations. Finally, the defendant stepped up.
"My full name is Andrew Gilbert. I am 40 years old and past. I was born near Gothenburg, Sweden. When I left Sweden, I was 18 years old past 18. I moved to the east coast of the United States. Have been around in Idaho off and on for 8 years.
Gilbert then went on to talk about living in Coeur d'Alene and Lewiston, where he worked both as a placer miner and as a cowboy. The American dream seemed more elusive than Gilbert first expected. He found himself fighting day in and day out to keep afloat financially. But he refused to give up. He put in his time mining and caring for his horses and 35 cattle. But on the election day, November 6th, he found himself in utter disbelief when he saw the saloon keeper, Augustus Skaggs, riding down the street on his very best colt, an animal that went missing that April.
I inquired where he got him, where he got the colt.
I bought him. I bought that Colt from Mr. Smith.
I told him it was mine and I was going to take it home. That if there was any doubt on my part about the Colt, to go get the sheriff of Mount Idaho and come over.
Joe sold a horse he claimed to have found and did not own. Gilbert got his horse back and the authorities just left it at that. Gilbert could not understand how there could be zero repercussions. He had worked so hard for everything he had. He could not have his neighbors stealing and selling what little he did own. And he became increasingly more frustrated that no one cared about upholding the law. After getting into the argument with Joe Smith on December 4th, 1901,
right on less ground than you are standing on.
You.
Yes, you.
I say, boys.
Andrew Gilbert stayed at the saloon, where he played cribbage and discussed plans with Pete Olson about slaughtering a cow the next day. During this time, the beer and whiskey disappeared as fast as it could be filled. The men left the bar likely seeing double and headed home. And yet the cold night air did little to damper Gilbert's hot temper.
When I arrived at Smith's, I was walking and leading my horse and talking to Pete.
But when they reached Joe's tent, he stopped. Suddenly he could no longer hold down that rising anger.
Pete, will you hold my horse a minute? I would like to go in and see a gentleman.
Gilbert went on to explain he only wanted to talk to Joe. But Joe, misunderstanding his intentions, attacked him. It was not until they were outside, after being shot in the throat and fighting over the gun, did Gilbert claim he finally pulled the knife. Joe kept pushing Gilbert's head under the water. He couldn't breathe, but he also couldn't let go of the gun. So with his free hand, he began to stab. In the process, Gilbert cut 3 of his fingers on his hand to the bone on his own slippery knife. Before the proceedings even concluded, Gilbert's attorney, Clay McNames, was already working on getting a retrial, claiming that Mount Idaho could not provide a fair and impartial trial. Constant threats of lynching could be heard in every saloon. Nancy Smith and her father, Joseph Earp, had a strong network of friends and family in the community. After an unnamed witness confronted attorney Clay on the street and threatened,
I understand you're one of Gilbert's attorneys, and by God, I want you to understand that I'm a witness for the state. And if you cross-examine me or say anything I don't consider right, I'll kill you like a dog. I've already killed 2 men, and if you're not damned careful, you'll make a 3rd.
Clay believed the little Nancy had orchestrated these threats, attending court every day to remind everyone she would see those who failed to help the prosecution killed. Deputies supported this by testifying that Clay did in fact tell the truth. Judge Steele denied the motion. Idaho County had failed in its first attempt at a jury selection, causing the sheriff to have to go back and find more people who were not in some way connected or related to the deceased or the defendant. This trial, which lasted 2 weeks with every witness examined and re-examined, was proving incredibly expensive for the community. Judge Steele ordered the trial to proceed. The jury met and returned with their verdict. Judge Eager Steele delivered the sentence.
That you, Andrew Gilbert, for the crime of murder of the 2nd degree, to wit, the killing of Joseph Smith on the 4th day of December 1900 in Idaho County, State of Idaho, be taken hence by the sheriff of this Idaho County to the jail of Idaho County, State of Idaho, and taken hence from said county jail within 30 days to the state penitentiary at Boise City, Idaho, in the state of Idaho. And you, the said Andrew Gilbert, there be imprisoned and confined at hard labor in the state penitentiary for the term of your natural life.
On January 6, 1901, Andrew Gilbert arrived at the penitentiary, where they dressed him in stripes and gave him the number 811. The penitentiary contained 124 prisoners, a 17.5-foot sandstone wall, a dining hall, 2 cell houses, and construction already underway for 2 more. Though Gilbert did not stay in prison long enough to see the completion of these new cell houses. As with many lifers, Gilbert remained on perfect behavior, and on January 28th, Warden Charles Arney, still fuming over Samuel Bruner's escape a month prior, ranked Gilbert as a first-grade or trustee prisoner. Not a bad look to have as Gilbert went in front of the Idaho Supreme Court that May, in which his lawyers brought forth 36 errors in the case. The Supreme Court dismissed them, affirming the judgment of the lower court in Gilbert's case, who, after serving only 1 year, still had a life sentence to go. Andrew's time in prison remained unremarkable. He got up, did his work, followed the rules, then went to bed. The next day, he arose and repeated the process. His life became an endless rhythm of days and patterns. His application for pardon in 1906 denied again. The following year, still in perfect behavior, Gilbert began to struggle emotionally. Prison officials worried about him, so when a letter arrived that year from friends assuring him he still had many supporters in Idaho County who held every intention of coming to Boise soon to help him with his release, they thought this news would boost his morale. But it did not. On the 17th of May, 1907, while working a shift in the prison power plant with Gilbert, Dave Harwood went to get his colleague for dinner around 10 p.m. and could not find him. After searching more carefully, he ran to tell the guards, who immediately began to search. Gilbert was gone. No one found themselves in more shock than Warden Whitney, who deeply trusted Gilbert. He told the Idaho Statesman,
"There are some indications that he has had assistance and simply hiked. We have been checking up pretty closely around here of late and have found evidence that indicates Gilbert may have been advised by prisoners and outsiders to make a getaway. I am more convinced, however, that Gilbert's mind has become unbalanced and has caused him to wander away from the grounds. He had been acting queerly of late, sleeping and eating little, and his talk indicating that he was off."
That night, a man coming down through the foothills of 8th Street saw in the shadows of the brickyard a man in oily overalls watching him. The traveler, a little unnerved, continued on his way and did not learn of the escape until 3 the following day. Guards and bloodhounds arrived at the brickyard on May 20th, found the trail leading up 8th Street and towards Idaho City. They were able to determine the footprints did belong to Gilbert, and yet the dogs refused to follow them. Later, they learned he'd wrapped his shoes in old oil rags. Wanted posters were distributed offering a $50 reward. The posters and reports in the newspapers emphasized his strange bow-legged walk, the scars on his face, and his unmistakable Swedish accent. The second printing held this ominous message at the bottom of the page.
"Use caution in arresting this man. He will fight."
On May 21st, Gilbert stopped at the Sweet Ranch above Emmett, where he asked for dinner. The camp wrangler, Shaw, agreed as most cowboys would, claimed to be looking for horses, remaining polite and cordial. A full week later, the ranch learned of the escape and reported what they'd seen. Gilbert made his way through the mountains of the Little Salmon, across Race Creek, and passed near the small settlement of Lucille. On May 30th, he took dinner and shelter at the Reed Ranch, where he supposedly told the rancher,
"I am Andy Gilbert, the man who was doing time for killing Smith."
But Reed scoffed at this. So Gilbert unbuttoned his shirt and showed the scars on his throat where Joe's bolt grazed him. Back in Boise, reports were starting to leak out from the penitentiary that Gilbert's escape had not been an attempt to find freedom, but rather to find revenge. The Idaho County Free Press published,
"Since his escape from the prison, it has been learned from fellow prisoners that Gilbert's intentions were, if he ever escaped, to come to Grangeville and vicinity and inaugurate a carnival of murder by taking the lives of many of the men who gave evidence or served on the jury which found him guilty."
Captain D.P. Rich and Guard C.S. Stone saddled up and rode out, making their way to Clearwater. On May 31st, Gilbert took dinner with the Otto Ranch, carrying a pickaxe and a gunny sack, telling them he worked as a prospector. Before leaving, he did ask them about a few specific individuals, and if they were still living in the area. On June 1st, a stranger startled a new farmhand named Peters at the Lanchesters. Gilbert told the boy he was waiting for the Lanchesters, promised to do Peters' chores, and send him along his way. Gilbert then went to sleep in the barn. The boy found this odd, but when the Lanchesters returned and seemed quite pleased with the visitor, any concerns he might have had went away. For the next 10 days, Gilbert stayed at the family's home. Captain Rich, on learning about the stranger at the Lanchesters, went and hid out in the trees and brush of their ranch, while Guard Stone arrived and pretended to be a cattleman looking to buy. When Stone took dinner with the family, he casually mentioned,
"The state is offering an award of $50 for the capture of Andy Gilbert."
The comment had the desired effect, as he could feel the growing discomfort in the home. When Stone finally found himself alone with Mr. Lanchester, he demanded,
"I want you to take me to Andy Gilbert, and I want you to produce him."
Why, Stoney, what do you mean?
Stone threatened to put him under arrest, to which Lanchester finally broke down, admitting Gilbert had stayed with them for 10 days, before they transported him across the river. Stone informed Lanchester he needed to do the same for them. But when Lanchester, Stone, and Rich attempted to cross the river, the current picked up and the boat got out of control, almost killing all three. A mile down the stream, they were able to make a safe landing on the bank. But Gilbert was now long gone.
The search will not be given up, and every effort will be made to capture the bloodthirsty brute who has on more than one occasion expressed his intentions to kill as many as the good citizens who were instrumental in his conviction as possible. His life is of no consequence, and he undoubtedly counts on revenge at all hazards.
As far as I know, no one in Grangeville involved in the trial ever died or mysteriously disappeared. All the same, the prison never recaptured Gilbert. He stepped off the pages of history and into mystery. Despite her attempts to rebuild her life, 18-year-old Nancy and her son Granville had some tough years ahead. In 1901, the 18-year-old married 55-year-old widowed blacksmith Furman Davidson. Just 2 years later, in 1903, he died from a heart attack. That same year, she married 27-year-old rancher George William Daring. The pair went on to have 2 daughters and were married for 10 years. On June 26, 1913, around 11:30, George saddled up to go looking for a missing bull. Nancy told him she wanted him home before dinner, and George assured her he would only be gone a short time. That afternoon, quite annoyed, Nancy sent Gran to look for his stepfather. The boy did not go far before George's horse greeted him. The horse, now riderless, had its bridles and reins pulled nearly off, and blood smears covered the animal's back. Neighbors gathered in search for George, and that evening they discovered his body in the woods, shot through the neck. Because they could not find a gun at the scene of the crime, the coroner ruled it a murder. With no obvious suspects, a week later, George's 22-year-old nephew, James Deering, was arrested and held in jail for 8 months before the court dismissed his case. George's murder remains unsolved to this day. Now, I understand the risk of bringing this story up following the escape of Gilbert. It would be all too easy to blame all unsolved murders in the community on the man who escaped the prison, supposedly bent on revenge. But a few things to consider. Everyone in town knew Gilbert, and no one had seen him in years. This death took place 6 years after his escape. And finally, George had nothing to do with his conviction, making Gilbert not a suspect in the murder.
Basically, she's had this terrible luck of these 3 husbands. 2 of them are killed.
2 of them are murdered, yeah, like brutally.
One is 55 and has a heart attack. Yikes.
Oh my gosh.
In 1917, at 34, Nancy married again, this time to the 25-year-old sawmill operator Hans Fritz Gerlach. Together they went on to have 2 children, bringing Nancy's total to 5 kids. But Nancy's tragedies were not over yet.
Oh, poor Nancy.
On June 26, 1923, the 22-year-old Granville worked with his stepfather as they dropped a blast in the well they were digging. Gran tried to tell Hans to wait before going down into the well. knowing they needed time to let that gas clear. But Hans, just 9 years older than Gran, had no intention of letting his stepson tell him what to do. He descended in the well and was immediately overcome by the gas. Gran, stuck on top, knew going into the well would mean death for him as well. But staying at the top meant he would have to watch his stepfather die before his eyes. So Gran made a terrible decision. He tied a rope to his waist and gave it to the two women, then went in after Hans. Gran made it 26 feet down to the bottom of the well, working as fast as he could. As his vision began to blur, he cut Hans loose, untied his own rope, and with his last few breaths, tied it to Hans. Then, Gran fell unconscious. The women were able to heave Hans' body back to the surface. A neighbor arriving at the frantic scene managed to get to the well, get a rope around Gran, and pulled him back to the surface. After several incredibly tense moments, Hans and Gran both began to breathe. What Gran's had just done was undeniably stupid, reckless, and insanely brave. If it were not for his truly, utterly selfless act, Hans would have died, and his mother would have been widowed yet again. Hans and Nancy had lived in Oregon for the rest of their lives. Hans died in 1966, and Nancy died in 1971. Gran married twice and had 4 children. He died in 1992, at the age of 91. But prior to that, both in 1923 and 1931, Gran received recognition for the well incident. 31 years after Andrew Gilbert had knocked over Gran's baby crib in a fight with his father.
My God, Nancy, pull him off me. He's killing me.
31 years after Joe Smith asked, with his dying breath, to have his baby boy brought to him.
I hope God Almighty will take care of you and my little baby,
so he could kiss his son one last time. Granville Monroe Smith received the Carnegie Bronze Medal and Hero Fund Commission in recognition for saving Hans Gerlach's life in 1922. A reward that no doubt would have made his father very proud. My sources for this episode today are newspapers.com, ancestry.com, familysearch.com, findinggraves.com, Andrew Gilbert's Idaho prison file, and my biggest source, Andrew Gilbert versus the state of Idaho, 1900.
Ah, that's so sweet. I love that. Yeah, that was a great story. I really want to know what happened to Mr. Andrew. Where is Andrew Gilbert?
Personally, I don't think Andrew Gilbert was quite the boogeyman as the newspapers made him seem. But I also don't think Nancy was the criminal kingpin that the defense believed her to be either. Still, there is undeniably more to this story than first meets the eye.
Well, very well done, and congratulations on your first short one. It's not too bad, right? It's not bad.
Thank you, Skye. I'm going to try and do more of this in the future, I promise.
Oh my gosh, nice job. Wow. All right, Skye, what do you have for us?
Today, I am talking about number 1146, Caddie Shupe. Just up top, let me just say I will be doing some pretty big rabbit holes today, especially about Mormon history. Caddie has very deep roots in early Mormon history. We're going to dig into that a little bit as well. Speaking of Joseph Smith.
Different Joseph Smith.
Yeah, that one was killed too. Yeah. Caddie Shupe was born Caddie, and let me be clear, it's spelled C-A-D-D-I-E. We've always pronounced it Caddie, though I could see a world in which it's pronounced like Katie, but we've always said Caddie. We'll kind of keep it Caddie. Her name was Caddie Medora Phelps, born on July 29th, 1869 in Montpelier, Idaho, to Joseph Morris Phelps and Eliza Clift Phelps. And her parents, as I mentioned, were prominent members of the early Mormon church. Her father had been born in Missouri. Her mother had been born in Nauvoo, Illinois, both very prominent places in early Mormon history.
Absolutely.
In fact, according to Joseph's obituary, so according to her father's obituary, his father, or Caddie's grandfather, was one of the men locked in jail with Joseph Smith and Parley Pratt and others in Richmond, Missouri. And for my well-versed Mormon friends and listeners, this jail stay is actually kind of famous in early church history. It kind of comes up every once in a while when talking about what happened to Joseph Smith after they kind of move into that western Illinois, Missouri area. To kind of just go over it quickly, one night while these prisoners, Joseph Smith and people who are in the leadership with him, are being held in this jail, the guards of the jail start talking about all of the raping and pillaging and plunging that they had done among the Mormons while at Far West, Missouri, which was the epicenter of the early church and the extermination order that came out of Missouri. So according to the story, they're cursing and swearing and just saying disgusting, shocking things about undoubtedly people that these leaders knew and loved. And so finally, able to take no more, Joseph Smith rose to his feet and, according to Parley P. Pratt, quote, spoke in a voice of thunder or as the roaring lion, end quote. And he rebukes these officers. He basically says, like, silence. He has some very choice words for them. And he basically says, if you do not stop talking, like, God will strike you down. It just says it with this fierceness. The officers after that go completely silent, and there's this hush of shock and awe that fall over the jail, both among the jailed and the people who had just been saying those things. According to her father's obituary, his father was in that jail, in part of that.
Wow.
Truly comes from pure Mormon stock. Both of her parents had crossed the plains at an early age. Joseph, her father, had driven 2 yoke of oxen at just 14 years old. Then they settle in what we now know as Idaho. Again, the family had also been part of those who had fled as a result of that extermination order in 1838, signed by Missouri Governor Lilburn W. Boggs, which forced Mormons to leave the state or risk being killed. Also, maybe not surprising that being members of the early Mormon church means that they did practice polygamy. Eliza Caddie's mother was Joseph's second wife, and he had married her about 4 years after marrying his first wife, who had actually died. The marriage to Caddie's mother wasn't a polygamous one, but he is going to eventually marry 4 wives total, with 2 more kind of at the same time as Caddie's. This makes Caddie one of 24 children.
Wow.
She had at least 4 full siblings, but records are unclear about how many were actually full and how many were half siblings.
I can barely keep track of my brother's names as is.
I was going to say, yeah, my siblings' birthdays. Like, how do you keep track of
seriously
more than 3 of them?
Yeah.
Wow.
Before we go any further, too, we should talk about the setting of the entire story I have today, which is Montpelier, Idaho. Well, with the exception of the prison, but obviously all the rest in Montpelier. So we actually heard a little bit about Montpelier in Sam's holiday story about Bob Meeks and Samuel Bruner, but we haven't really dug deep into the town's history on the pod before. Montpelier is in Bear Lake County, which is the most southeastern county in the state. The area was the traditional home of mostly Shoshone-Bannock tribes, but probably overlapped with Ute tribes as well. And as a side note, I found this really cool source. It is an ArcGIS map that shows overlapping layers of the traditional lands of every indigenous tribe in the world, and it's listed in the native language. Each tribe is listed in their native language. And so when you click on each tribe, it will take you to a page that talks about tribes who are related, maps, treaties, websites, and physical sources that tell you like how they know this is that area. So really, really cool. If you're interested in that, I will list that in the sources at the end. Really, really cool. Anyway, one side note.
That's cool.
So Bear Lake County, and especially Montpelier, grew out of the Oregon Trail and the Mormon pioneers blazing the trail to Utah. The first major settlement in the area was Paris, established by Mormon apostle Charles C. Rich in 1863. Now, allegedly, when Rich was settling in the area, they originally thought it was still part of Utah, then quickly learned it was actually Idaho, which is always one of my favorite facts. Once Paris had been established, Brigham Young personally chose 16 families to migrate north of Utah and establish another town nearby Paris. And apparently, Caddie's parents were one of those families. And in fact, Caddie's paternal aunt, so aunt on her dad's side, was married to Charles C. Rich, who settled Paris. So they are all basically settling royalty, if you will, in this case. And then, annoying Skye fact, one of Charles C. Rich's great-granddaughters was actually a somewhat famous actress in the 40s and 50s. Her name was Lorraine Day. She's in a Hitchcock movie called Foreign Correspondent. She's in a popular series of movies about this character named Dr. Kildare. She worked with stars like Cary Grant, John Wayne, Gregory Peck, Ronald Reagan. And apparently early in her career, she established a playhouse company specifically for Mormon actors in Los Angeles. And she remained Mormon her whole life, even during sort of the height of her Hollywood years. So anyway, another rabbit hole.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So Caddie and her family, they moved to the area nearby Paris in June 1864. They established a town that they originally called Clover Creek, but eventually Brigham Young is going to change the town's name to Montpelier after the capital of Vermont, where he had been born. As I mentioned, the Oregon Trail really helped grow Bear Lake County in Montpelier. Just a few miles southeast of the town was apparently one of the steepest and longest stretches of the Oregon Trail. Travelers called it the Big Hill. The descent was so steep and difficult that even today, the hillside still bears scars of the ruts left by wagon wheels that locked up as they came down the hill. And you can still see them off of US Highway 30. So if you're interested, you start going west on US 30, you find a pullout called the Thomas Fork Pullout, drive about 5 miles, and you'll eventually find a historical marker off the side of the road that describes the Big Hill, and you can still see the ruts. They have pictures online, you can still see it. Cattle Creek, which eventually becomes Montpelier, was originally the place that travelers stopped to water the cattle after descending the Big Hill. That's part of why it really starts to grow. And in fact, in Montpelier, today, they have the National Oregon/California Trail Center, which simulates a wagon trip on the trail. So it's like a fun little museum stop if you're in the area or traveling through. The whole experience is about an hour long. So if you're interested in hearing more about how the Oregon and California trails really built Montpelier, you should stop by. From Montpelier, the trail goes north through Soda Springs, Idaho, and then moves west through Fort Hall and onto Oregon and California. In 1882, the tracks for the Oregon Short Line Railroad were laid through Montpelier, and because of this, of course, the town would grow even more. Apparently, the railroad brought with it the first non-Mormon residents of the town, and out of this, 2 distinct communities develop in Montpelier. Apparently, uptown Montpelier became known as Mormon Montpelier, and downtown Montpelier became known as Gentile Montpelier.
Downtown Montpelier? Like, oh, where are you going tonight? Oh, we're going downtown. Like,
yeah.
Montpelier is not big enough.
Right,
to
yeah.
have a
Well, and that's
downtown.
also what's so funny is that, like, so divided by religion that you have just the Mormons on this one side of this tiny little town, and then you've like Gentile. So it's like, oh, instead of even saying downtown, you'd be like, yeah, we're gonna head over to Gentile Montpelier. It's very funny. But yes, it's a good point that, like, Montpelier, not very big. And then, as we know, Montpelier had the first bank in southeastern Idaho, which was robbed by Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. In 1893, Montpelier was incorporated as a town, and by 1900, it was the largest town in Bear Lake County.
You can definitely, if you go through Montpelier, go to the bank that was robbed. And there's a whole Butch Cassidy museum there. It's really fun. It's a fun, there you can buy so many fun little gift shop items.
It's honestly, Montpelier's pretty fun. But in the 1870s and 1880s, while Caddie's growing up, the population noted in the U.S. Census grew from just 120 to about 550. So she's growing up as the town is really starting to get big. Back to Caddie. One day, in May 1885, Caddie's father Joseph was making a transaction at a business in Salt Lake City when he was approached by a deputy marshal who served him with an arrest warrant, and this arrest warrant had been sent by Idaho deputy marshal and well-known anti-Mormon Fred Dubois. Knowing what we know about Fred Dubois and what we know about Caddie's family, Anthony, Sam, do you know what charge Caddie's father was arrested on?
Unlawful cohabitation.
Ding, ding, ding. You are very correct. Joseph was returned to Blackfoot, where he was found guilty. According to the Deseret News from December 9th, 1885, Joseph made this statement before sentencing. He said, quote, "I am a little sorry that I am arraigned here for a practice that I believe to be a divine doctrine. It is part of my religion, and while I am amenable to the laws of the land, I hold there is a higher law. I wish your honor to take this view. I have endeavored all my life to live according to the laws of the land. I tried a good while to find that Mormonism was wrong. I am convinced it is divine. I would not give a cent for a religion that does not go further than the bonds of this world. My blood runs as thin as any man's when I see the flag of my country. I love my country, and I always have endeavored to instill a patriotic spirit in my children. I do not wish to weary the court. I could say more." End quote. And the sentencing judge, Judge Hayes, replies with this, which is actually pretty brutal. So he says, quote, "Mr. Phillips, I had hoped and expected better things from you. You are a man of intelligence and are certainly endowed with many manly qualities. I expected from you obedience to the law. You claim its protection. I learned that you have been industrious, and I understand that you have been able to accumulate a competency. It is by the protection of the law that you are able to secure a competency, and it is by it you may be permitted to enjoy the result of your industry. I had hoped and I had believed that one endowed with your intelligence and with the power to see the future and to see what your present ruinous course must lead you to would accept the situation. You have seen it fit to pursue the other course. I have but one duty to perform. Painful as it is, that duty shall be performed in pursuance of the oath I have taken, without shrinking. The judgment and the sentence of this court is that you, Joseph M. Phelps, be imprisoned in the territorial prison of the Territory of Idaho for the term of 6 months, and you further be fined the sum of $300. In addition thereto, you are adjudged to pay the costs of the prosecution of this case, which are taxed at $100. In pronouncing the sentence of the court, I have this to say: being guilty, you have resisted the law. You have put the government to the expense of trying you, and having done this, you must pay for it. You may sit down. The judge really has no patience for that. And so Caddie's father actually serves time in the same exact prison that his daughter would.
I mean, can you imagine how debilitating? Like, if you're a farmer and you're off the fields for 6 months, and like $400 essentially at that time is so much money.
Whew. A lot of mouths to feed.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Remember, he's got 3 wives and 24 kids. This isn't, and that's not to say that even on a family of 6 that wouldn't be devastating, or a family of 4. But a family of 24 is going to be near impossible. He is out within 6 months, which we know because on September 30th, 1886, the Deseret News reported that Joseph M. Phelps had been killed in an accident about 30 miles outside of Montpelier near Cokesville, Wyoming. He had been traveling alone in a wagon hunting for chicken and other fowl when he was shot in the head. Now, as far as I could tell, authorities couldn't find any evidence of foul play, pun not intended, so they theorized that after he had shot some game, he stepped down out of the wagon and the gun accidentally discharged. Others had testified nearby that they had heard gunshots, but no one exactly knew what had happened. And I will say this, that squeamish listeners, please skip ahead about 15 seconds. Because unfortunately, the newspapers described the gunshot as having blown the top of Joseph's head clean off.
Yikes.
A short time after everyone had heard the gunshots, a man traveling toward Cokesville found a horse and buggy standing still in the road with Joseph's body under the body of the buggy between the wheels. And as mentioned, he left a family of 3 wives and 20 living children. Now, with this many children, understandably, and also, again, I think being part of the church at this time, unsurprisingly, Caddie is soon going to leave her family's household and start her own when she marries a man named William G. Shupe on February 6th, 1888. Now, William Shupe was born in Riverdale, Utah, and like Caddie, he came from original Mormon pioneers. His father, James Wright Shupe, had actually served in the Mormon Battalion. Sam and I can speak to having grown up in the church, and Anthony, you have pioneer stock as well. I feel like you kind of hear about the Mormon Battalion, and I don't know if you ever did like a trek, one of those summer activities where you like do the handcart thing, but there is a point where the men all leave and women have to go up this hill by themselves, and that's actually to kind of simulate the Mormon Battalion. But that's all the more I really hear about it. So I was just had to check this out, and in parentheses in my notes it says, "I'm so sorry, this is who I am as a person now." Because to understand the Mormon Battalion, we have to do a quick refresher on a few important pieces of American history. The first quick refresher is this thing called Manifest Destiny. For the 1844 election, so we have to go all the way back to the 1840s to get to this Mormon Battalion stuff, the presidential candidate James K. Polk ran on a platform that supported the idea of manifest destiny, which is this idea that America is destined to stretch across the entire North American continent from sea to shining sea, right? That's where that phrase comes from. But in 1844, the U.S., by this point, only reaches as far west as Missouri. So the idea is we're destined to stretch there, so I'm going to be doing things to help get us out to that point. Just before Polk was inaugurated as president, his predecessor, John Tyler, had annexed the Republic of Texas, and that just basically means that he and Congress worked together to bring Texas into the U.S. after Texas had won its independence from Mexico a few years before that. The second thing to note is President Polk wants the land that Mexico owns. The land that Mexico currently owns goes from Texas to the western coast of California and up to Oregon, and then you hit Oregon, that's British territory. Texas is disputing its border with Mexico, saying saying that their state consisted of more land than Mexico was claiming it did. You've got Texas trying to say, we have more land than Mexico is giving us, and Mexico saying, no, their land is not nearly as big as they're claiming. Hoping to bait Mexico into war, in which the U.S. might be able to get a big chunk of land, Polk sends troops down to the border. It's kind of waiting for something to dust up. A few skirmishes inside the Texas-Mexico disputed territory gives Polk enough evidence to convince Congress to formally declare war on May 13th, 1846. Third thing to know is, as a result of the extermination order in Missouri and being driven from Nauvoo in the winter of 1845 after Joseph Smith's death, many early Mormon saints settle in Iowa. And here, what they're trying to do is scrap together money to fund their trek westward. So by this point, Brigham Young has come out and said, it is our destiny to move westward, which you'll notice sounds kind of similar to what's going on in a broader sense. Brigham Young has said, we're going to move west. They've been run out of their homes in multiple states. They don't have a lot of money, and of course, it takes money to move west. With this Mexican-American War declared, Brigham Young spots an opportunity to gain government assistance for this new Mormon migration. So just 8 days after Congress had declared war, Elder Jesse C. Little arrived in Washington, D.C. to advocate for the Latter-day Saints. And he manages to get a personal meeting with President Polk. And there, Elder Little convinced the president that Mormon pioneers could provide military support and protection in the West as American settlers moved into the area. So the president offers aid if Little could raise a battalion of 500 men to help fight in the Mexican-American War, with the special goal of pushing through to California and protecting those lands until more permanent settlement was possible. Thus, the Mormon Battalion was born. President Polk's diary entry said this about his decision, quote, the main object of taking them into service would be to conciliate them and prevent them from assuming a hostile attitude toward the U.S. after their arrival in California, end quote. And Brigham Young said the purpose of the battalion was, quote, to allay the prejudices of the people and to prove our loyalty to the government of the United States, end quote. So they're actually kind of setting out to do the same thing, right? The U.S. is trying to ensure that they don't break off and sort of start their own hostilities with their displeasure at like how they've been treated. And the Mormons are trying to say, listen, we are on your side, United States. We're not trying to break off from you. We're trying to be part of you. President Polk assigns a man named Colonel Stephen W. Kearny. If I have any big Civil War or Mexican-American War nerds, he's the uncle of Philip Kearny. I actually talk about him in Arlington a bit. So Stephen Kearny is to accompany the Battalion of Mormons to California. In July 1846, 543 Mormon volunteers enlisted in the battalion, officially called the Mormon Battalion, United States Army of the West. There are about 5 companies of about 100 men each, companies A through E, but most professional military officers were non-Mormon. All of the men who enlisted were expected to stay in California after reaching there to create a Mormon community, but also knowing that the Rocky Mountains was going to be the center, essentially, of Mormonism. Because of the idea that they were going to be settling out there, the battalion was also accompanied by 35 women, some serving as army laundresses, and also followed by a few children. So there were actually families moving out west. So first, the battalion started their march from Council Bluffs, Iowa to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, about 170 miles south. At Fort Leavenworth, they were outfitted with arms and ammunition. They were given $42 for clothing, but since uniforms were not mandatory for their particular battalion, many soldiers sent the money to their families to save for the trek west. And some sources even say that Brigham Young had one of his right-hand men go to Fort Leavenworth to force the Saints to hand over the money that they had committed to contribute when they volunteered for service, but that's kind of legend. From Fort Leavenworth, they began traveling towards Santa Fe, Mexico, but what we now know as New Mexico. But this was not easy. Their first leader, Lieutenant Colonel James Allen, got sick and died before the battalion even got underway. A new leader, Lieutenant A.J. Smith, was chosen from professional officers, but many men in the battalion didn't like Lieutenant Smith, especially because they felt they hadn't had a say in who was chosen as leader. Smith and his military surgeon, Dr. Sanderson, treated the men of the battalion like trained military men, holding them to the same intense military standards of physicality and discipline as trained soldiers, which they're not, which I can imagine if you aren't trained for military service and being treated like you were trained for military service, it's going to be miserable. And then on top of this, the battalion is marching through the American Southwest between July and October. It's excessively hot. They suffer from lack of food and medical care from a man they didn't trust, and they were forced to march long stretches at a time. But they reach Santa Fe, and once they do, another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook, which I wonder if that's who St. George is named after, took over. And he recognized how difficult the coming 1,100-mile trek is going to be for the soldiers. Plus, they had already had a detachment of sick officers sent to Colorado for tending to. Cook sends 2 more sick detachments, plus all of the women and children in the battalion, to Colorado, which is a total of about 270 folks. That leaves about half the battalion left. The rest of the men left Santa Fe to finish their journey to California. They left on October 19th, 1846, and they crossed the Continental Divide in northwest New Mexico on November 28th. As they reached Tucson, Arizona, they anticipated a possible battle with Mexican forces stationed there, but by the time they reached the town, Mexican soldiers had abandoned their position there. On December 21st, 1846, the battalion camped on the Gila River in central Arizona and then began moving north toward what is now Los Angeles. And the Mormon Battalion finally reached California on January 9th, 1847, and they had started their trek to Fort Leavenworth in July, maybe early August. So it took them about 6 months. Eventually, they reached Temecula, California, which is roughly halfway between Anaheim and San Diego, not toward the coast, but instead inland toward the mountain. And this area of Temecula had just a few weeks before their arrival been the site of a massacre. And so in early December 1846, the Battle of San Pascual had happened near San Diego when a local band of Luiseno Indians attacked a group of Californians. They called them Californios, which were Hispanic Californians. And the Indians killed 11 of these Californios. In retaliation, combined forces of the Cahuilla Indians and Californios attacked the Luiseno Indians at Temecula, killing between 35 and 40 of them. Because the Mormon Battalion passed through after, they actually stood guard to prevent any further bloodshed while the Luiseno people buried their dead. But within 3 weeks, they were camped at their final destination, the Mission of San Diego. 6 months after leaving Iowa, the Mormon Battalion had trekked nearly 2,000 total miles, participated in no combat, had actually gotten into a real-life bullfight when they had been charged by a group of wild cattle, and had lost 22 men due to disease and other factors. On January 30th, 1847, just 2 days after the battalion arrived in San Diego, Lieutenant Cook issued orders commending the duty of the men who served, and he said, quote, "History may be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry. Half of it has been through a wilderness where nothing but savages and wild beasts are found, or deserts where, for lack of water, there is no living creature." End quote. Here are just some quick facts about the Mormon Battalion, and then we'll get out of here. Their nearly 2,000-mile trek constitutes one of the longest military marches in American history. It is the only religious unit in U.S. military history recruited solely from one religious body and having a religious title as their unit designation. And then lastly, the men who served in the Mormon Battalion would participate in some of the literal building of the American West. They helped build a thing called Fort Moore in Los Angeles. Some were actually among the first to discover gold in Fort Sutter in California in 1848. Some came upon and buried human remains from the Donner Party in the Sierra Nevadas, and many reached the Utah Territory within just a few years of reaching California. Caddie's father-in-law, part of the Mormon Battalion. Then, also according to her father-in-law's Find a Grave page, he was assigned by Brigham Young to rescue 2 handcart companies who left desperately late in the season. For those familiar with Mormon history, you might recognize them as the 2 famous companies called the Willie and Martin handcart companies. So long story short, most of the members of the Willie and Martin handcart companies had immigrated directly from England, having been converted by missionaries there. Now, they didn't leave England until May 1856, when, according to most practical recommendations, they should have already left the Midwest with their wagons by May. Now, in this case, they actually do handcarts. Handcarts were much cheaper than full wagons, which made them attractive to the generally poor and maybe even middle-class families who usually immigrated from England to make the trek to Utah. The members of the Willie and Martin handcart companies don't leave Iowa City, Iowa until mid-July. By the end of September, about to enter late fall and soon early winter, both companies were only just then crossing Nebraska. They are entering the plains, the Great Plains, in what is now late fall, early winter. When they reached Fort Laramie on the eastern edge of Wyoming, they needed to resupply, but there weren't any provisions to buy at the fort. So from there, they had to cut back food rations, and many families had to literally lighten their loads, discarding food and blankets and other things that they would need later. And so they're in a really dire situation. By October 4th, Brigham Young had heard of the situation and put together several rescue companies, bringing with them wagons of supplies and food for the suffering travelers. On October 19th, before the rescue people could reach them, the region was hit with a major blizzard and the companies were forced to stop and take shelter where they could. The Willie Company was a little further ahead than the Martins, so when the blizzard hit, they were just about to climb this thing called Rocky Ridge, which was notoriously one of the most difficult and steepest stretches of the trail, and they were going to have to do it in knee-deep snow with howling winds whipping around them. This was so brutal that 13 members of the Willie Company died that night. Further behind, the Martin Company had just crossed the North Platte River near present-day Casper, Wyoming when the snowstorm hit, and many of the members were still wet from crossing the river, causing them to suffer hypothermia and frostbite from the storm. By this point, too, many travelers had very little to cover their bodies, and some were even barefoot, literally leaving bloody footprints in the snow. Unable to go any further and in some of the hardest conditions of their whole trip, they were forced to find shelter until a few members of the rescue party, perhaps including James W. Shupe, found them. This group with the rescuers were forced to find shelter in an area nearby called Martin's Cove until more rescuers arrived. The Martin Company was so far behind even the Willie Company that a backup relief party had gone east, even further east than the first rescue party had, and they were so far east they assumed that the company must have gotten lost. But Brigham Young had to write and tell them, if you haven't found them, keep going. That's how far behind they were. And this was so crazy when I found this, and part of why I wanted to tell the story, but actually my great-great-great-grandfather, his name was Ephraim Crossley, was a member of the Martin Handcart Company and was just 5 years old when he crossed the plains with his families. And sadly, his oldest brother Joseph, who had a hip disfigurement but had still crossed the plains, died 4 days before the backup party had found the company and took them safely to Salt Lake. And so it's actually kind of likely that my family and the Shupe family, or at least James Shupe, would have known each other or met each other, which was a connection that's kind of crazy to think about.
That's wild,
right?
Skye. I love that.
But in total, about 980 members began the journey of crossing the plains to Utah in the Willie and Martin Handcart companies, and at least 213 people died from those companies while crossing the plains. 68 from the Willie Company and at least 145 from the Martin Company. Her family and the family she marries into are from literal Mormon pioneering families.
And then to be guided by faith to this kind of, motherland, this new creation, this new city and idea. And then after all of this hard work, and then you get there, and then you still have to build, and it's a lot of untamed desert, and oh my gosh, it's amazing that it ever happened and is now such a prosperous space.
Caddie and William, both from literal pioneering Mormon families, married on February 6th, 1888 in Bear Lake, Idaho, and they settled in Montpelier. So they're like, Mormon royalty almost. So their first daughter, Blanche, was born about a year after their marriage in 1889. And over the next 10 years, between 1890 and 1900, they had one more daughter, Leona, and 3 sons, Wallace, Sterling, and Brian. And then in about 1901, their last son, Winfield, was born. Now, his full name is Winfield Scott Shupe. He's actually named after a famous commanding general whose name is Winfield Scott, who was in charge during the Mexican-American War. So I wonder if they took that name because of his dad being involved in that Mexican-American War. Now, Caddie, according to the Montpelier Examiner from July 27th, 1900, was even somewhat involved in local politics, listed as serving as a distributing clerk for the upcoming elections. About a month later, she was replaced by someone else, but the reason for giving up the position isn't clear. But she is, involved, obviously, in society. Then, on March 6th, 1903, the Salt Lake Telegram reported that Caddie and William's 8-year-old son Wallace had been injured pretty gruesomely. Gruesome enough to make the newspapers, at least. So he had been playing with what the newspapers refer to as a giant powder cap, which I think could refer to two different things. The nicer option is that it refers to the cap, which is part of a cap gun. The things that make the popping sound that sound like a gun but aren't actually discharging anything. It's just basically like a light percussion cap. So that's the nicer option, is that he was just playing with like a big one of those. The worse option is that it refers to an actual percussion cap. It's the same thing as a cap gun, except the gunpowder and the ignition that it sets off is a lot bigger, a lot more dangerous. It's the thing that makes the bullets go out of the gun. And it's not totally clear how he got it, what exactly he was doing with it, but this is from the newspaper. It says, quote, "The boy had found several of the large caps and was playing with some other children when one was struck off, blowing off the thumb and the ends of 3 of his fingers." Kind of loses a hand. So he's injured, loses most of his hand in this way, but he's going to go on to survive. And I found that a decade later, he was actually the manager of the Rex Theater, one of 2 motion picture houses in Montpelier, which promised, quote, "new pictures every night," end quote. Even despite his injury, he would go on and really make a lot of himself, which is cool. 2 years later, 1905, this is going to be a big year for Caddie. And, as you might guess, not in good ways. On March 3rd, the Montpelier Examiner listed her name among the Montpelier citizens who were delinquent in paying for their stocks in the municipal irrigation company. She owed $1.10 on 2 stocks. Now, this is kind of a big guess, but any guesses as to how much $1.10 is in 1905?
Oh, I'll just say $89.
Okay.
Maybe around 10.
Okay. No. It's a good guess. And you guys are kind of in the middle. It's actually about $40. So not outrageous, but she probably should pay it. And then the big news breaks on July 3rd, 1905 in the Salt Lake Telegram, and it's titled "Tragedy at Montpelier, Idaho." On the day before the article was published, quote, "Arthur Douglas, a well-known citizen of the city, was killed by being shot with a pistol at an early hour here this morning. The shooting took place at the home of Mrs. Caddie Shupe, where Douglas had been rooming. Immediately after the killing, the officers arrested Mrs. Shupe pending an investigation. She claims that Douglas committed suicide using her pistol. The ball entered the breast near the left nipple, and death was instantaneous," end quote. And pending the investigation, Caddie was held in the Bear Lake County Jail in Paris, Idaho. Now, Arthur Douglas, according to the paper, had been a, quote, "old-timer along the short line," end quote, where he had worked as a telegraph operator for the railroad, and he was apparently also well known as a local saloon keeper in town. This article from the Salt Lake Telegram was also the first that I found to report that Caddie and William had actually been divorced, quote-unquote, sometime before. On the same day that the news broke of this death, on July 3rd, Caddie was formally charged with murdering Arthur Douglas. She waived preliminary examination, which meant that her case would be put on the docket for the next session of the court. As the days passed, more details came out about what had happened. She had been divorced from William, according to the newspapers, about a year and a half before, so roughly at the end of 1903, beginning of 1904. And as a single woman with a family of 6 to take care of, she needed to bring in washing and other odd jobs to make some money. And as we've seen many times before, she's going to take in boarders, like many of our other women inmates. And of course, one of these boarders is going to be Arthur Douglas. Arthur Douglas, according to census records, was part of an Irish immigrant family who had first settled in Nebraska in the 1870s, and likely because of his career on the railroad, Douglas ended up in Bear Lake County by the early 1890s. In Montpelier, he married a woman named Jenny Woodward, but it's unclear how long this marriage lasted. Then, in 1903, he started living at the home of Caddie Shupe as a boarder. According to the Daily Utah State Journal, which is a newspaper from Ogden, Utah, Caddie and Arthur started to grow closer as they spent an increasing amount of time together, and, quote, "together they lived, apparently, as man and wife," end quote, which means they got a little physically intimate. Imagine every dramatic movie about affairs you've ever seen, right? That at the height of their affair, Douglas is constantly making promises about how much he loved her, how that he was going to buy her a home and provide for her and her children, saying all these things that people in the throes of love or maybe lust would do and would say. Most of these next details come from an article that appeared in the Montpelier Examiner on July 7th, 1905, and I think these are the details of the story from Caddie's statement to the police. And so after he had lived at Caddie's home for a couple of years, most articles say around 2, Arthur left and he lived somewhere else. And while he was gone, Caddie is constantly writing letters to him, asking him to return, reminding him of all the promises that he had made to her. In reply, he first writes that he would return on June 10th, 1905, but he didn't. Then he wrote that he would return by June 20th, but he didn't. Finally, Caddie wrote a letter in which she told him that if he didn't come back by July, quote, something terrible would happen, end quote. She would later say that the something she was referring to was that she would take her own life, but you can understand why this statement is very much going to come into play a little bit later. Surprisingly, Arthur did return on July 1st at about midnight, and almost as soon as he walked in the door, he and Caddie start fighting. Caddie asked if he planned to keep his promise and come back to live with her. He answered, quote, that he didn't know, he couldn't tell, end quote. But she kept pressing him, demanding that he answer her. Finally, completely fed up with her, quote, he said in great anger, "For Christ's sake, shut up," end quote. Caddie, after this, tries a change of tack, asking why he was so upset, why he didn't want to come back. Was it something she had done or said to make him so unhappy? Was he not happy with the surroundings of her home? As I was reading this newspaper article, you could almost hear her pleading for answers. And again, if you can envision that sort of romantic movie, dramatic movie, that sort of peak where all these promises that one person thought was going to last is just out the door, just disintegrating in front of their eyes. Apparently, he told her that he had received letters from a woman in Utah, one of which told him that she was traveling to Montpelier to live with him, so he's saying that he had sort of started this relationship with someone else. And again, Caddie began to ask, to demand, if he intended to go with this woman, quote, and leave her and her children out onto the world, end quote. And he only kept replying that he didn't know, he couldn't tell. After undoubtedly several moments of tense, angry silence between them, with Caddie moving in and out of the room, she finally announced that his bathwater was ready for him in the kitchen. So he changed out of his dirty clothes into his nightshirt to take a sponge bath. So after washing his upper body and his feet, he complained that there was a draft coming from an open window near the pantry, and he asked her to shut it. And as she moved through the pantry doorway to shut the window with her back turned, she suddenly heard a shot ring out. Turning quickly, she said that he sprung out of the chair that he'd been sitting in, and afraid he was going to shoot her, she screamed and ran past him out of the room. After exiting the room, she turned back toward him, and she heard him utter a single word, her name, Caddie, before he fell face down to the floor. A few moments later, she ran back into the kitchen, trying to splash some water on his face to get him to wake up, but, quote, in a short time, she seen he was dead, end quote. In another room of the house, 4 of her children were sleeping and apparently had not heard the shot. Caddie actually woke them, asking them to get dressed and to go to the neighbors for help. One of her sons had called Arthur's brother, Henry, to let him know about the tragedy. Henry rushed to Caddie's home, arriving about 1:30 in the morning to find his brother dead on the kitchen floor with his right arm stuck under his body and a revolver a few feet away from his left arm. A Dr. Pointer arrived at the home a few minutes later, who determined that Arthur had died almost instantly from his gunshot wound. Once the chief of police arrived, he took Caddie's statement and arrested her. Dr. Pointer, along with another doctor, Dr. Guyan, performed a post-mortem examination and determined that the bullet had entered Arthur's body, quote, slightly to the left of the breastbone, ranging downward and piercing the crown of the large artery of the top of the heart. The direction of the bullet indicated that the pistol had been held very high in front of the body and at an acute angle. There were no powder burns on the body, end quote. And then the article that talks about all of this ends with this description of Arthur Douglas, quote, Arthur Douglas was well known throughout this section of the state. For a number of years, he was employed as an operator on the short line and had worked at various points along the road. About 4 years ago, he located in Montpelier and engaged in business with his brother. He was a man of somewhat peculiar traits, and while generally liked by those who knew him, he had no intimate companions among his friends, and did not seem to care to associate with other men when not at his place of business. He was strictly honest, however, in all his dealings with his fellow men, and was especially particular about meeting his financial obligations. A marked peculiarity of the man was his apparent desire to hide his good qualities and let the public know only of his bad deeds. He had of late years espoused the principles of socialism and was most enthusiastic in the advocacy of the principles when engaged in the discussion of politics. His peculiar traits were manifested in the wishes he had expressed on different occasions in regard to the way in which he wished to be buried. In a letter, he stated he wished to be buried in a coffin made from rough lumber and that a sheet should be the only thing about his body, that no religious services should be held at his funeral, and that no headstone of any kind should mark his final resting place, that none of of his relatives should be informed of his death until after his burial, and that the place of business in which he was interested should not be closed on account of his death or during the time of his funeral. All of these requests were complied with by his brother Henry, with the exception of the two latter. His brothers and sisters were immediately notified of his death, and his 2 brothers and 2 sisters came to attend the funeral, which was held Tuesday morning. The services consisted only of a short address by Dr. Guyon. The body, wrapped in a sheet, confined in a rough homemade coffin, was followed to the cemetery by the bereaved relatives and a large number of their sympathizing friends. Thus ended the final chapter in the life of a man who had experienced much of the bitterness that comes to many in this world, and whose tragic death was brought about by the ill-chosen manner of his living. Caddie's trial began on July 23, 1905, presided over by Judge Alfred Budge, and yes, his name is Judge Budge.
Judge Budge.
Judge Budge. Yeah, he's so good. The day before the trial began, the Daily Utah State Journal reported that over 50 witnesses had been subpoenaed. It had apparently been hard to seat a jury because of the opinions of the people in the area who read the newspaper accounts. One of the first things that happened was that Caddie's lawyer, J.A. Bagley, submitted a demurrer, or an objection, for the charge of murder, quote, on the ground that it failed to allege that the action complained of was committed with the intent to kill, end quote. And so I think what this means is her lawyer filed to have the charge reduced because there wasn't enough evidence of premeditation, which is usually key to the charge of murder, but it doesn't make it clear what the charge was changed to or from. It just always says she was charged with murder. So the court agreed to amend the information of her charge, and in that case, then Bagley agreed to continue the trial without delaying. And despite the Daily Utah State Journal estimation that it would be hard to seat a jury, the Montpelier Examiner stated that it took much less time than expected, finding 12 men out of 35 in the pool. So it really didn't have to go through that much. The next day, the prosecution, led by Jesse Budge, who is Judge Budge's brother, by the way, he gave the prosecution case. This is what the Montpelier Examiner said, quote, "We were unable to hear any of the testimony introduced by the prosecution, but understand that much of the evidence brought out exploded the theory that Arthur Douglas committed suicide," end quote. Witnesses introduced statements that at one time or another they'd heard Caddie say she would kill Arthur. An expert from Browning & Brothers, which is a gun manufacturing company still in business known as Browning, an expert from there testified that a revolver fired from less than 4 feet away would leave powder burns, but if you remember, there were no powder burns found on Arthur Douglas's body. Therefore, it would be highly unlikely that he would be able to fire a gun at himself from more than 4 feet away. The 2 attending doctors at the scene, Dr. Guyon and Dr. Pointer, stated that based on the trajectory of the bullet, the revolver must have been at a high acute angle, making it very difficult, though not impossible, they had to concede, for Arthur to have shot himself. Witnesses also testified there had never been any verbal threats of suicide from Arthur Douglas prior to his death. Then the defense brought their case, and it hinged on really attacking Arthur Douglas himself. From the Montpelier Examiner, quote, "The defense opened with a statement from Attorney Bagley of what they intended to show, that the character and traits of Mr. Douglas were such as would lead to self-destruction, that he cared nothing for the society of women except to satisfy his lustful desires, that circumstances had brought him to the point where he could no longer bear his shame and disgrace, that life had no more charm for him, and self-destruction was the inevitable result." They also argued that up until Douglas had come into her home, Caddie had had a reputation for, quote, "morality, virtue, honesty, integrity, peace, and quietude," end quote. They argued that he must have ended his life in a moment of remorse for leaving Caddie and not keeping the promises he had made to love her and take care of her and her children. Witnesses took the stand to vouch for Caddie's good character, which changed only after Douglas came to live with her, they said. At one point, Caddie took the stand herself and, quote, "is said to have made a good witness," end quote, according to the Morning Examiner from Ogden. The Salt Lake Herald said that she gave her testimony, quote, "in a loud, clear voice, which at times rose to a high pitch as she narrated how she demanded of him on the night of the killing to know if he intended to desert her and take up with another woman. For 3 hours she held the rapt attention of the 12 jurors, who were to decide whether she had committed murder or not. Neither her own attorney nor the prosecutor interrupted her recital, and she was given the liberty of saying what she pleased and as much as she pleased. She took advantage of this to recite many things that had been shut out of the evidence of others. She revealed some things in her testimony that other witnesses were supposed to talk about, and either sort of cut ahead of them letting out that information, or that was information that in their prior testimony had not been revealed as of yet. When the prosecuting attorney asked if it was a fact that she had not shot Arthur Douglas during a disagreement, quote, "she shrieked her answer back that it was not, nor was she even out of humor that night. She repeatedly protested her innocence, and when the examination was finished, there were many moist eyes in the courtroom," end quote. The Montpelier Examiner later wrote of this event, quote, "She was subjected to a rigid cross-examination by prosecuting attorney Budge, but she stuck to her story without material deviation. When asked if she fired the shot that killed Arthur Douglas, she replied in emphatic terms, 'No, sir, I did not,'" end quote. Final paragraph in the Montpelier Examiner article read like this, quote, "The case has been the all-absorbing topic of conversation this week among the citizens of Montpelier, many of whom have attended the trial both as witnesses and spectators. The general sentiment is that the jury will return a verdict of acquittal, but some believe they will fail to agree upon a verdict," end quote. According to a report from the Salt Lake Herald, the courtroom was packed every day with spectators, quote, "more than half of the audience being ladies," end quote. And it was hot. This is southern Idaho in the summer, and you're clothed in all those layers of cotton and wool. No, thank you. Right at the end of the trial, according to the Salt Lake Herald, this really weird but interesting thing happened. Like, kind of gives me a little bit of a thrill to read it. So interesting. So, apparently, the prosecution had called a couple witnesses whose purpose it was to contradict the defense's claims that Caddie had led a moral and upright life. Quote, "They were expected to give personal experience that she was immoral," end quote. In other words, these people, men, have been brought to testify that they had had sex with her, that she was not as moral as she had claimed. Now, whether this was true or not, unknown, of course. So just before one of the witnesses began to testify, the prosecuting attorney requested that the judge ask the ladies in the courtroom to leave because I guess the testimony would be too much for their sensitive natures. Judge Budge asked the ladies that perhaps they should leave, but the ladies in the room were having none of that. Turns out that some of the spectators were, quote, "some of the most highly respected and best-known women of the county," end quote. And they argued with the judge over being made to leave, saying if they had to leave, then the male spectators should have to leave too. But Judge Budge wouldn't budge. And then in parentheses I put, "Do you hate me yet?" And he made the ladies leave. So I love this, that they're saying, ladies, you should leave. This is going to be really sensitive. And they say, why should we leave? If we are being made to leave, then the men in the gallery should be made to leave as well.
Right.
He makes the ladies, Judge Budge makes the ladies leave. Once the ladies had left, the prosecutor finally turned to the witness and asked what the general reputation of Caddie was. The man responded, quote, that to the outside world it was all right, end quote. The prosecutor then asked if the man had had carnal knowledge of Caddie Shupe, to which Caddie's lawyer jumped out of his seat and objected loudly. Judge Budge sustained the objection, to which the men who remained in the courtroom began to clap in approval. Quote, "When the ladies found out what had happened, they crowded about the judge and congratulated him on his stand in upholding the objection, while the remarks they made about the witness were about as uncomplimentary as a woman can think of. The whole affair was about as unusual as anything that ever happened in the courts of the state. A more indignant lot of women folks that can be found in this country was never known in any section of the country," end quote.
Wow.
I love this. So the women are like, we shouldn't have to leave. The judge is like, sorry, you have to leave. And then as soon as the prosecutor gets to the entire question, which is basically like, have you had sex with Caddie Shupe? Her lawyer stands up and objects. And when the Budge says, like, objection sustained, everyone claps and is like, congratulations, you didn't let them give this terrible evidence against her. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Wow. It's so unfair to use that at a trial. What dirty laundry to throw at someone else to just try and bring down the opinion of the jury on them. And especially 1905 Montpelier, like it would have worked. It would have really just smeared her reputation. And if she was acquitted or if she gets out of prison, she's going to have a hard time coming back to that community after all of those things are said.
Right. But I think it also speaks to, I think to some extent, that the reputation she does have in the community, that basically, that when it was objected, everyone said, like, yes, you weren't going to let them say those awful things about her. Like, they all seem to be on her side. And that's actually what these newspapers say a lot, is that the sympathy of the town is with her. She grew up with them. She's from up to pioneering families of that area. So, yeah, really, women of Bear Lake County, rise up. The jury retired to deliberate on the afternoon of July 30th. They discussed and deliberated for more than 9 hours, finally reaching a verdict at 2 a.m. on July 31st. Caddie Shupe was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but the jury recommended mercy to the court for sentencing. From the Idaho Daily Statesman, quote, "The sympathy of the community has been largely with the defendant, and many thought she would be acquitted, but the evidence, while circumstantial, was damaging against the defendant," end quote. The next day, August 1st, Judge Budge sentenced Caddie to 6 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. The Montpelier examiner stated that when she arose to receive her sentence, she was holding her 5-year-old son in her arms. Caddie herself took the sentence stoically. Quote, "The prisoner did not shed a tear or show the slightest sign of emotion." The Daily Statesman also reported that the sentence was rather surprising, given the fact that the jury had recommended mercy of the court, probably because of her children. On August 2nd, 1905, the traveling guard from the Idaho State Penitentiary, Rube Robbins, traveled to Paris to take Caddie up to Boise to begin her sentencing. And the Daily Statesman wrote, quote, "The prisoner behaved well on her trip and was entirely cool," end quote. The article also stated that her 6 kids would be cared for by her family. Some would live with her mother, and some with one of her brothers. So here is her intake form. Number 1146, Mrs. Caddie Shupe from Bear Lake County. Crime, voluntary manslaughter, sentence 6 years. Age, 36, born in Montpelier. Legitimate occupation, housewife. Height is not listed. Complexion, light. Weight, 120. Hair, reddish brown. Color of eyes, dark blue. Conjugal relations, separated. Has 6 children. Father, not living, died when she was 16. And prisoner left parents' home when she was 18. Of course, had religious instruction, attended Sunday school, and was still part of the Mormon Church. Was given a common school education and attended school for 8 years. Habits of life, abstinent. Makes sense. The nearest relative is listed as her mother, Mrs. Eliza Phelps. Under general remarks, under peculiarity in build and feature, it's listed slight in stature, somewhat stoop-shouldered. The condition of her teeth were poor, and she had several false fronts. And the property found on her were 55 cents, and all other property in her possession as well. And this is honestly probably because in the women's ward they didn't have uniforms, stripes or anything that they had to wear, so she probably got to keep the clothes that she was wearing. When Caddie entered, she was just one of 3 inmates, and the other 2 are other big hitters who I covered all the way back in season 1. One is Josie Kensler, and the other is Jenny Daly, and it's interesting to note that all 3 of these women were convicted for killing their lovers or their husbands. By the end of 1905, they would be joined by 2 more women, funnily enough, both in for burglary. Evelyn Clark in for second-degree burglary, who I cover in episode 50, and Mrs. Mary Allen, who's in for first-degree burglary, which Anthony and I covered all the way back in episode 29.
Stealing a ham.
Yep, stealing a ham, that's right. And we don't have much by way of official records in her inmate file, and I think we can probably assume that her time in prison fairly normal. On January 30th, 1906, an article from the Daily Utah State Journal reported that Blanche Shupe, Caddie's 17-year-old daughter, had been charged with violating quarantine regulations. Now, it was reported there was actually a big smallpox epidemic in December 1903 in Cache and Box Elder counties, which is in the northern part of Utah, both of those. And at this time, smallpox is still, of course, an incredibly deadly disease. According to the 1905 disease mortality rate report from the Census Bureau, the annual average deaths from smallpox was 3.7 out of 100,000. With the U.S. population at just over 83 million in 1905, that means about 3,100 people died on average from smallpox every year. So breaking quarantine regulations had to be taken very seriously. Apparently, Blanche had been living in Salt Lake City, where they think she picked up the disease. She then went to Ogden, where she was at the home of her uncle Peter Shupe, and that was where she started to show symptoms. After the doctors come to examine her, they confirmed that it was smallpox and she needed to quarantine somewhere. Now, Peter and his wife consented to let her stay at their house overnight, but they said their house isn't very big and they have a lot of kids. And so obviously they're very nervous to have a smallpox patient in the house with them. When a man with the title of sanitary inspector, his name is Albert Power, he goes to Peter's house to see Blanche. Peter at first said that Blanche had run off, but he later admitted he'd driven her to the train depot and bought her a ticket for Salt Lake City. Peter said that it was her idea, that once she'd found out she had smallpox, she didn't want to stay in Peter's home and demanded to be returned to Salt Lake City. So she left her uncle's home and went to another house, presumably before her quarantine period was up, and she was arrested. So their concern here is, of course, that she has been diagnosed with smallpox, incredibly contagious. She gets on a train to go from Ogden to Salt Lake with this very contagious disease, and so now she's put everyone on that train and everywhere else that she went at risk. The newspaper reported that, quote, there was much in the case of the girl to incite pity, and the judge ordered her to go to Boise where she might be near her mother, end quote. Ultimately, though, she's going to go on a little bit of a trial, and Blanche will be found not guilty by the jury, and she was discharged. It's unclear if she did actually go to Boise to be closer to Caddie. I could see that the judge perhaps suggesting that when they go to trial, that instead of being put in jail, maybe she go to be with her mother. But then when she's discharged, there doesn't have to be. But I could also imagine her perhaps staying at the children's home down the street from the pen. She was 17.
That's super interesting. That's one of those stories that, like, in 2019, we may not have included that in this episode, but because that's something we all experienced, wow, weird. Wow.
Well, and that this is even before 1918, which is where we're going to see kind of that first big push of quarantine laws and really, making sure we lock things down because of that Spanish flu. And then, like you say, now we completely understand. Caddie, again, all the more we really have about her time is that her daughter was arrested. Of course, doesn't really have anything to do with her. Her parole, Caddie's parole agreement was signed on November 3rd, 1908. She was released after serving 3 years, 1 month, and 1 day, so serving roughly half of her 6-year sentence. And she was returned to Bear Lake County to live with her family. Soon after she left the penitentiary, the Bear Lake prosecuting attorney wrote a letter to the warden saying that Caddie had expressed to him that she wanted to make a trip down to Utah in the very near future to perhaps buy some property. She had told him that if she liked the property, she and William, her ex-husband, would go in on the property together to make a home for their kids and maybe even remarry. The attorney adds in the letter that he had the opportunity to watch Caddie closely, and everything that she had done had been above reproach, even recommending, if the board saw fit, to pardon her completely. Now, unfortunately, there aren't any records in her inmate file to indicate that she ever received a full pardon, though it does certainly seem that she makes a better life for herself moving forward. Despite the claims that she would remarry William Shupe, in the 1910 census shows her as the head of the household, still listing her marital status as divorced. In this 1910 census, she lived in Montpelier with all of her kids except for her oldest Blanche, who had been married in 1907. Caddie worked as a dressmaker, probably also taking in laundry and again other odd jobs to make money, and over the next several years she integrates herself back into the community. Sadly, in 1915, her son Wallace, the one who had maimed himself in the gun accident, passed away from what the newspapers described as, quote, obscure brain trouble and other complications, end quote. And sadly, he was just 23 years old at his death. He'd had a budding career as an electrician. He'd actually worked at the Utah Power and Light Company and, as I mentioned, managed local movie theaters. The Montpelier Examiner wrote of him, quote, many a boy confronted with such adverse conditions as he was would have made a failure in life, but Wallace set out with a determination to overcome the obstacles which confronted him and was succeeding in a fair way when stricken down with a fatal illness, end quote.
I love that.
Yeah, I know. The Montpelier Examiner details 3 times when her grown children returned to town to visit their mother, including both of her daughters after their marriages. The paper also lists her name as a member of the committee in charge of refreshments for the town's 4th of July celebration in 1916. About a month later, her name was again listed among those who were delinquent in paying their property taxes, this time for about 66 cents, about half of what she owed the first time. 1916 would be a good year for another reason. Caddie remarried to a man named Oscar T. Drennan in Blackfoot. Well, it may be a good year, because even after she marries him, the newspapers continue to refer to her as Caddie Shupe, and other than that marriage record, I can't really find them living together in the 1920 census or really any other formal record evidence of their marriage. But we also know in 1916 it is the middle of World War I, which 2 of her sons, Brian and Sterling, actually fought in. And in March 1919, Sterling wrote Caddie a letter, part of which was published in the Montpelier Examiner on March 21st, and it says, quote, Dear Mother, I suppose you think I am a good one for not writing to you for so long, but please forgive me for this time. The reason I have not written you before was because I don't belong to the 146th Field Artillery anymore. I belong to the Quartermaster's Corps. I will try and explain how I happened to get out of my old outfit. On our way to Germany, we were to stay overnight at a big town named Esch. Well, I was on the sick list at the time, having ran a nail in my foot while working in the kitchen a few days before. Well, the next morning I was so lame and sick that I couldn't walk, so my outfit went on without me. The next day I reported to a different outfit and they sent me here. I think I will be in this outfit from here on out. My foot is better and I'm feeling fine again. Hope you are all well and happy, and that I will soon be home with you again, end quote. And it's important to note, too, that this letter comes in March 1919. This is well after the war is over. And even though the war is over, it actually takes almost half a decade to get all of the American expeditionary forces back to the U.S. from their places in Europe. So that's why he's still in Europe even after all these times, but also how much of a bummer where it's like, yeah, I fought in the war, I'm just waiting to go home and I got a nail in my foot working in the kitchen. Such a bummer. A few days after she gets this letter, she received word that Sterling had landed in New York from France, and her other son, Brian, who we don't have a letter from, he was being sent to Fort Russell in Cheyenne, Wyoming to be discharged from duty, and both of her sons had returned home by June 1919, for which I'm sure she was very grateful. According to the 1920 census, she was still living in Montpelier, and only her son Brian was living with her by this point. But by the end of 1921, her health began to deteriorate. She checked into the LDS hospital in Salt Lake City on December 31st, 1921, and she passed away the next day, January 1st, 1922, from uterine cancer at just 52 years old. And she's buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And I will end with this line from her obituary from the Montpelier Examiner, which read, quote, "Mrs. Drennan was an estimable woman and was loved by all who knew her," end quote. That is the story of number 1146, Caddie Shupe. Now, real quickly, let me read my sources, and there's actually so many of them. Of course, her inmate file from the Idaho State Archives. We love our Idaho State Archives. Ancestry.com records, especially Find a Grave. Newspapers.com. That ArcGIS map I was telling you about the indigenous tribes, that can be found at native-land.ca/maps/native-land. Please go check it out. It's very cool. An article from the Lewiston Morning Tribune on April 12th, 1962. The page on the Montpelier history on bearlake.idgenweb.org. The historic Montpelier page from the Bear Lake County Chamber of Commerce website. An article titled Utahns in Classic Film from the everydaycinephile.com. That's not my website, but it should be. The brochure of Auto Travel Guide of the Oregon Trail through Idaho from the National Park Service. An article from the Mormon Historical Studies by Alexander L. Baugh titled Silence Ye Fiends of the Eternal Pit, Joseph Smith's Incarceration in Richmond, Missouri, November 1838. A letter written by Parley P. Pratt in 1853, listed on the Jarrett Pratt Family Association webpage. The page about the Mexican-American War on PBS.org. Support PBS, please. Pages about the annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1845 through 1848, from the Office of the Historian website. The Utah History Encyclopedia entry by Susan Easton Black on the Mormon Battalion, found at historytogo.utah.gov. The Mormon Battalion, 1846 through 47. An excerpt from California Saints, a 150-year legacy in the Golden State, by Richard O. Cowan and William E. Homer at the Religious Studies Center website at byu.edu. An article on the Temecula Massacre at temecula.gov. A complete list of the members of the William Martin Handcart Companies compiled by Dr. Susan Ward Easton, found at byu.edu. Timeline, rescues of the William Martin Handcart Companies and the Hodgetts and Huntwagon Companies at history.churchofjesuschrist.org, which is the official LDS website. The 1905 mortality statistics report from the Census Bureau, found at cdc.gov. U.S. yearly population on demographia.com. A report found at the USU Digital Commons of a presentation done by a student named Erica Stone called Pest Houses, Quarantine, and Smallpox. Utah newspaper reporting on quarantine in the early 1900s. And then just some quick facts and the sources that came with those facts on Wikipedia from Montpelier, Idaho, Bear Lake County, Charles C. Rich, Lorraine Day, Mormon Battalion, Mexican-American War, Nauvoo, Illinois, Temecula Massacre, William Martin Handcart Companies, Browning Arms Company, and American Expeditionary Forces.
Way to go, Skye.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Yeah. I like that it touched on so many things and so many facets of like what you're fascinated by.
Yeah.
You know, film history,
I know.
LDS history.
That's why I'm telling you, as soon as I started, I found the stuff about, I think, the Mormon Battalion first, and I was like, oh boy, this is bad news for listeners, because I'm loving this. Plus, it's cool to have like a tiny bit of a family connection, even if it's through her in-laws.
Yeah.
But yeah, kind of crazy. So yeah, thank you all for really going through me with that. Sorry it was so long, but I was so excited to finally have one longer than 30 minutes.
That was great.
Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Wow. Yeah. And looking at her mugshot too, like there's that like sense of just remorse. And,
yeah,
sometimes you don't see that.
Yeah.
In mugshot,
like she really just kind of looks like a mom from the early 1900s who has grown up in this vast wilderness and who is trying to make ends meet and got caught up in the romance, right? And of this guy and all the promises that he's making and really interesting. And yeah, her mugshot is really, like you say, kind of, I don't want to say haunting, but she's looking almost directly at the camera. The look on her face is so somber. So yes, it's an excellent, we will of course be posting that on Instagram, on Facebook to check out.
Yeah, well, awesome job, you guys, both of them. Both of these stories are amazing.
Thank you all for listening. We appreciate it.
Well, everybody, do your own time.
And do your own number.
Special thanks to voice actors Rob Goodwin, Chelsea Stagg, Jack Horcade, Draven Brown, Tristan Hafer, Jerry Broad, Peter Fidel, Eric Overzet, Kane Scaffer, JC Brain, and Virgil Clark.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook.